Welcome back to Guard Beardy in the next chapter of the Veil Riders. I can't get my program to work and make the text scroll like I want it to, so I'm just going to give up and do static images. If you by chance know any good software that can allow me to do scrolling text in a contained field, that'd be nice. And drop it down in the YouTube comments below if you know anything good that I can use. But besides that, it's good to have you here again. Let's get on to the next chapter. Chapter 7. The rain never stopped thundering down the entire way back to the city of Emil, Norris, soaking those who were on horseback and deafening those who rode inside the trucks. To ease the burden of the horses, the wagons were hitched to the Humvees and dragged behind them. The curious thing about these elven horses was their innate intelligence, and were more than happy to trot behind the towed wagons without any handlers or ropes to guide them. Yule and 10 of his dragoons arrived before the rest, having ridden ahead with their captive strapped to the saddle of one of their horses, while the rest of the dragoons escorted the trucks back to the city. If it weren't for the fact she were female, they would have dragged her behind the horses the entire way. But while Yule was angry, he was not a monster. Chickily landed soon after Yule arrived, fresh from visiting Zerg Company, and was almost beside himself when he laid eyes on the captive Blue Helmet. Chickily was more than happy to maul and eat the woman after her compatriots shot him, and had to be physically restrained by the dragoons and dragged away before he actually got his way. Indeed, the Blue Helmet prisoner was not exactly looked upon favorably, as news of Chickily's findings had gotten around very quickly. And it was a fair assumption that many inhabitants of the city wouldn't mind getting a piece of her, one way or another. As the rain poured on, tenders from the Sparkling Unicorn ran out to assist the Veil Riders and their horses, letting the Veil Riders retrieve their waterlogged gear after they dismounted, and then taking their mounts back to the stables that was attached to the inn. The prisoner was unhooked as well, and shoved harshly forward towards the door of the inn. Chicks was apparently lacking the patience to let her look around. And as the German woman craned her neck to look up and gape at the rain-slick buildings, Chick's boot checked her in the small of her back and sent her flying forward into the mud and runoff of the street. Chick's clicked her tongue as the prisoner splashed down, and made a show of unshouldering her long rifle. "Move it, hun." The woman sputtered, shaking the water from her face and hair as she looked back at the forward element of the dragoons, all of whom glowered down at her while fingering their weapons. Chickily was there as well, and grinned his massive fangs at her while rumbling in his throat. She stared up at them, wiping the mud and grime from her face as her uniform became soaked with the same muck she tried to brush off. That's enough of that. She already has a rough time ahead of her. Yule's boots splashed softly on the street as he stepped towards the group, having given his horse an affectionate pat on the rump while the tender led it away. He had coaxed his pipe back to life, and it glowed red from under the bill of his hat, casting his face in eerie scarlet. "Take this kraut inside. She has information we need. Give her water. I don't want her dying before I get what I want out of her." Yule puffed on a stem as Chicks and Domino leaned down to grab an arm each, dragging her roughly through the mud. Her knees and boot toes dragged, leaving grooves in the soft earthen road before thumping onto the stone sidewalk and then the front door of the inn. "Mr. Chickily, do you have a letter for me?" Chickily ground his teeth for a minute, eyeing the prisoner hotly as she was dragged away, but snapped out of it and quickly stepped his way over to Yule. "Chickily has a letter from Coco." Yule took the letter from Chickily's hand with an appreciative smile, and splashed through the street from the rain to read it, Chickily plodding behind him, opening it when he was under the cover of the inn's porch area. The dragoons that didn't go inside crowded around him to read as well. Cole gave a snort. "Dakota got himself a girlfriend, eh?" "Seems like it," Yule observed with a laugh, and continued reading. Coco could indeed use the trucks they picked up and the ammo, as well as any other extra things they could spare since they didn't have the dwarves in town like Yule did. Yule hummed to himself as he tapped the back of the letter with his fingers, then looked over to Chickily, He was rocking back and forth on his long, clawed avian feet. Chickily, he perked up his head and looked up to Yule expectantly. Do me a favor, would you? Could you grab some of the Harpies that can carry your heavier loads and have them meet me here tomorrow? I would like them to maybe run ammo and food for us. Chickily hears, he chirruped proudly, and instead of flying, took off at a run down the street, his nails clicking as he did. Seems he had enough of flying through the rain for one day. Yule watched him go with a smile, his pipe stem clicking in his teeth as he did, before turning back to his Veil Rider dragoons who stood about, thumbs hooked in their riggings or picking at their nails with their knives. Yule's face turned from amused to serious with a smooth transition, and he puffed hotly on his pipe, blowing the heavy, greenish-tinted smoke from his nostrils. He had run out of tobacco from Terra long ago, and had switched to the local varieties. The Kraut Blue Helmet. What are we doing with her? Cole asked, crossing his arms and tipping back his soaked hat. Yule bared his teeth as he spoke. Air funneled down the stem to heat the coals in the bowl of his pipe, casting red flecks of rage in his blue eyes. Break her. And break her they did. There was a little room in the rear of the sparkling unicorn that was normally used for meetings. For today, it was an interrogation room. Yethis was still with the vehicle convoy that was slowly making their way here. So instead they had Erinda, the inn's resident healer on duty. Those who joined Yule for the interrogation, a mixture of male and female Veil Riders, dropped their wet gear and uniform tops onto the table and chairs nearby. Dusky light filled the room as a few lamps were lit and the window curtains swished shut. Panic once again swam in the eyes of the Blue Helmet as she was tied to the chair, her uniform top still covered with the mud of the road and the blood of her dead fellows. There were no questions or reverence to begin with, no speeches or admonishing to be found. The Veil Riders just worked the Blue Helmet over for almost half an hour, until their knuckles bled from the exertion of it. Her face would have been a ruin if it wasn't for Erinda, who just clicked his tongue and healed her face back to perfection, just for the next Veil Rider to ruin it. The cycle continued, until she finally sputtered out in accented English. What do you want? What? The Veil Riders looked back at Yule, who sat in a chair a few feet away facing the Blue Helmet. His riders looked something akin to tavern brawlers as they panted or rubbed their knuckles angrily, some drinking from large flagons or smoking the local cigars made from mug root. Oh, is there something you wanted to tell me? He asked, puffing out a little cloud of smoke while raising his tankard to his mouth. She sputtered and looked about in panic. But I... Yule flicked his fingers at the Veil Rider that was currently on tenderizing duty, watching the German woman over the rim of his tankard as she slugged the Blue Helmet across the jaw so hard that a tooth rattled off the wall nearby. They continued to beat her for another half hour, Erinda putting her back together each time with a bemused look on his face, until Yule finally cleared his throat. The woman was panting and crying out, her boots scrabbling on the wooden floorboards as she writhed. She was completely intact, but the mental trauma was definitely doing its job. The pain would stay in her brain. It was only the physical damage that would go away. Why are you here? Why are you traveling through American soil? She moaned as she struggled to keep her eyes open, her entire body squirming in the anguish of it all. A Veil Rider stepped up, cocking back an elbow, but Yule held up his hand. Why are you traveling through American soil, Rheinling? Answer me. She panted once, twice, then mewled out an answer. Deals. They say deals on the inside. The rumble of engines outside alerted Yule to the arrival of the trucks, but his attention was squarely on the woman in front of him. Smoke hung in the air like stringy wisps of ghosts, and Yule clenched his tankard, the flesh groaning on the metal as he did. What deals, Rheinling? Inside deals. Inside deals with the other party, the Democrats. They seized control after impeaching the Trump, made deals, made the Veil a world effort. Horseshit, murmured Cole. That can't be true, whispered another. Yule glared at them, then back to the woman tied to the chair. Democrats are in control of the White House now. There's no way that shit would have passed with the Republican majority in the House. The woman lurched forward, tears streaking down her face, her voice almost lamenting. I don't know, I swear. All I know is deals were made, bribery may have happened, I don't know, it's all rumors. Your Midwest is almost in rebellion as it is, and now Russia is pressuring the other European countries for a bigger cut. We're here to control the roads and make a beachhead for getting resources back to the other side. She panted, looking around for any kind or merciful eye, but she found none in the room, not even from Erinda. And the folk who live here? Yule demanded, pulling his pipe from his mouth. The woman mewed in pain again, and then shrugged helplessly, before sagging in her restraints. We were told they were just another resource. Wolf, a rider from Missouri, growled in his throat and gripped his peacemaker with a rattle from his gun belt. Fucking scum. Yule smacked him on the leg with the back of his hand and raised an angry eyebrow at him. There was no need to act so high and mighty. Yule knew full well that there was no telling what the U.S. was going to do with the locals. They only held the high ground now because someone else was currently the bad guy. Not very kind of you to treat the locals like cheap labor. Yule stood and exhaled, plucking his pipe from his teeth and dumping the coals into a little dish the inn had provided before the interrogation had begun. Take her to a room. Ask the inn if they have a room with no windows. If they do, toss her in there and lock it. If she knew what was good for her, Yule looked down at the continually wincing woman, her eyes filled with constantly welling tears. She'd stay in there and not make a fuss. Elves may use her for a couch liner if they get a hold of her. She was untied from the chair, but her legs couldn't even bear to hold her weight, buckling as she tried to stand. She fell to the floor in a crumpled heap, and had to be once again lifted up by a pair of Veil Riders who dragged her up the stairs while calling for the innkeeper. Yule watched them drag her away as he took off his patrol cap and ran his fingers through his hair. If the government was working with the UN just to try and wrestle power in a party struggle, it was going to make a mess of home. The news of the Midwestern states almost being in rebellion wasn't exactly a shock to him. There's always been hushed bar talk of balkanization and succession if the government did something backwards or in opposition to the middle of America. But the Democrats bending the knee had to be money changing hands. There was no way. Just no way. That woman held more information in her head. He'd let her rest, then play good cop here soon. Yethis came splashing into the front door of the inn with everyone else, and shook her head to rid her hair of the excess rainwater that clung to it. When his NCOs came to report, Yule told them of all he was told by the prisoner, and told them to make sure the rest of the Veil Riders knew of it. Yule thought to himself, taking off Yethis's hat and giving it a shake, scattering water all over Gremlin, who was happily hugging a full fuel can to her chest. Perhaps he had been too hasty in not taking more prisoners. Next time, he'll tell his Veil Riders to try and keep maybe one or two alive on purpose, instead of lucking out and just winging one. The trucks brought in from the ambush were just parked along the road and left there, as no one in the city knew how to turn them on, let alone drive and operate one. The dwarves that walked by in their traveling cloaks showed an immense interest in the trucks, playing with the wheels and doors, and were finally able to wrestle a Veil Rider out of the inn to show them the engine. After a few minutes, it was like an entire clan of the stout fellows had popped out of the ground, and were scouring the trucks and taking notes in their little notepads, or taking measurements of certain spaces in the engine. Yule just watched from the door with a hot cup of tea in his hand, smiling at them as the steam filtered up through the air. The night passed with little else of note, besides the Veil Riders drinking and cheering themselves into a stupor while telling the locals how the ambush went. Some Veil Riders took the initiative to actually start learning the local language, so bits and pieces were very slowly translated to those who drank around and or with the Veil Riders, while other times a lot of pantomiming was used instead. If the Veil Riders ever went back home and got involved in a game of charades, they would be unbeatable by even the most seasoned of player. The next morning, Chickley arrived with a cluster of Harpies that were whole heads taller than him. A mixture of males and females that all had a kind of primal grimness to their faces. Unlike Chickley's smaller and cuter sparrow body type, these Harpies looked like as if someone had taken condors or great eagles and spliced them together with a human. Their arms were thicker, their chests broader, and their eyes burning with an intelligence that made Yule a little nervous. Chickley asked Himalayas to help. They agree in exchange for goods. Yule looked down at Chickley, then to the stalwart leader of this little band, a female with multicolored hair that was speckled with spots of browns, whites, and reds that reminded him a lot of Flecktarn. "What do you mean, goods?" The leader of the Harpies stepped forward, her long black claws clacking on the ground as she did. Chickley bowed his head slightly and stepped back, standing beside Yule now. She was far, far bigger than Chickley, but still shorter than Yule, her nose coming up to around the middle of his ribcage. "Yes, we wish to exchange services for Veil Rider wares. You have fine clothes, lightweight, won't weigh us down in flight. You also have fancy tools we could use." Yule noticed that unlike Chickley, these Harpies had a few more toes than the other ones he had seen. "Tools, you say?" "Yes, those little thunder sticks you sometimes use. We believe they could be of use to us. If you trade us a thunder stick for us to play with, and maybe make us some clothes, we will happily help you and your squires." Yule looked down at this little Harpy warrioress with a mixture of curiosity and acknowledgement. He gently handed his tin cup of tea to Chickley and dusted his hands off on his pants before holding out his hand. "Well, tell me your name so I know what to call you, and I think we can work out a deal here." The Harpy stalked forward smoothly, bending her head down to brush her face against Yule's hand and pin it against her cheek with her wing. She smiled softly as she leaned back up, her large pointed fangs glinting in the morning sun as her eyes studied him, her color-speckled hair falling prettily over her face. "Savarys," she whispered, and she fixed Yule with another kind of predatory stare. With the light on her eyes, Yule saw that they were not the brown color he thought they were at first, but a deep, murky merlot, and the color reminded him of old blood and rotting meat. Chickley made a nervous sound next to Yule and hunched his shoulders a little in fear, tea spilling slightly over the rim of the cup and spattering onto the ground below. The meeting ended quickly after a few more things were hashed out. When they were done, and Yule safely getting his hand back in one piece, the Himalayas flapped off to grab some gear they needed from their roost. Yule spun around, scooped up Chickley while flinging the contents of his tin cup in a bush nearby, and stepped off at a run to get as far away from that Harpy woman as possible. "Did you see her fucking teeth?" Yule panted at Chickley, looking over his shoulder to see that she was in fact watching him while hanging in the air in a kind of backward flying hover. "She makes Chickley seem like hatchling, her claws like tiny swords." Chickley craned his neck to look over Yule's shoulder, and his eyes widened as he too saw that she was watching them run. Yule skittered around a corner and saw the trucks in the distance down the road, and waved his hand to the Veil Riders that were loitering outside and smoking. "Chickley, let me tell you, next time you find some Harpies to help us, find less scary ones." Chickley agrees. And that's the end of this chapter of the Veil Riders. I hope you enjoyed it. More chapters to come. Next week may be a bit wonky. I have a tournament this weekend I gotta go to, so I might do a video instead on Tuesday instead of Monday. But I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked the video and videos like these, be sure to like and subscribe to Garbeardia, as well as click the bell icon so you know when the next video is coming out. Additionally, be sure to stop by Neckbeardia for even more weird story goodness that he puts out. If you like a nice female Irish voice, that's the place to go. But until I see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Guard Bro, and I'll see y'all next time.